Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a conversation with the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, together with my colleague, Professor Henry Stradom. Today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Judge's book, Judge's career, his life, what drives him. I hope this conversation is very interesting and exciting for all of us. I will invite you all to ask questions on this platform. We might not get to them all, but we will try and get to as many as possible. Just as a start, I'm going to spend a moment introducing a man who needs no introduction. It's almost difficult to try and encapsulate what you've done and what your career is like, Judge, in just a couple of minutes. What we know, you started your service to this country, to this nation at a very young age, spending time on Robben Island, having finished your matric and your first degree on Robben Island, and then swiftly climbed up the ranks of the legal profession from there, ascending to the role of Deputy Chief Justice, where you served, I believe, with love and with grace and with humility until your retirement in 2016. Judge, without further ado, I would like to hand the show over to you and allow you to give all your wisdom to us, what I know that you've come here to do. Afterwards, my colleague will be your discussant and talk a little bit about the comments that you've made. After that, we'll kick off a Q&A session, and I invite members of the audience to please send us your questions again. I don't want to leave you out of the discussion. Judge, over to you.
Miss Mokwena, I am particularly delighted. Let me start off again by thanking the Dean, who was here to say a few words before we went live, and Professor Henry Stradom, who will be interacting with later, and yourself, Mokwena. But I also hope that it will be an interaction with the broader community in the law faculty of the university, because there are many issues that really pop up, and the book has layers of themes. I thought what I would do with the initial few minutes would be to say a few things about the book at a high level in a generic way, and then hope and allow for discussion to evolve on its own. And my experience, I must confess to having done a few up to now, and my experience has been very lively debates and discussions, and indeed the chat room goes live in a very fascinating way. And in that sense, the book achieves part of its aim. All rise. Why? Most people would ask me. At a very peripheral, superficial level, all rise is a call to duty, which courts use here and all over the world to invite both judges, lawyers appearing before them, and the community to work, to duty. It's an invitation to start proceedings. At a little deeper level, it's an invitation to do justice, to engage the dispute, to deal with that scale which signifies justice, that equilibrium which has been disturbed and which has been upset. And there was an invitation to go and do that, to find that equilibrium, that stasis. And that's what just societies strive for, is to produce just outcomes as often as that society can. And the more that society can, the better the society would be. And the more impoverished people who are met with injustice at different levels, the less successful that society is. And therefore, all rise at the second meaning is really an invitation to do good, to do justice. 2, and 3, it's an opportunity to write history, I thought. All my life, barring a short detour, I've been a lawyer. If not a prisoner, then I was a lawyer. And up to the time when I became a judge and I retired. So it's all work that, frankly, I know that I did over easily 40 years. And therefore there is something to tell there. There is a story to tell. And then I needed to record the transition. Something important happened in 1994 in our country. And we can debate how important it is. I mean, some other campuses, they've said nothing happened in 1994, Judge, sorry. You old people have blown this thing up as if it is a seminal moment. It was no moment. And then I want to have that debate also. That's fine, we should have that debate. But then we inducted a new constitution. And the new constitution set new parameters on what law is actually, what are its functions, what does it hope to achieve, and what is the pecking order in our sources of law. Remember, we changed a lot of things and made the Constitution to be the primary source of all law, something that was not so. In the past, Parliament was the primary source of all law because Parliament was supreme, and because of parliamentary sovereignty, there was a different arrangement from the one that was inducted. And in the book, I take you through the early tensions between the adherence of exclusive common law, for instance, as the reigning way to look at law, and the induction of a new constitution that inevitably brought new legal reasoning, new way of adjudicating disputes. And I start with that at the beginning. And to remind you that actually the common law was common to the ruling class and not common to the populace. And much as we call it common, it never was to everybody. And I do spend a bit of time on that. But I move away from that and remind you that common law is part of our law because our Constitution says so. Indigenous law is part of our law because the Constitution says so, provided both succumb to the supremacy of the Constitution. Even legislative law, statutory law has to succumb to the supremacy of the Constitution. So, and I move away from that very quickly, having dealt with the history, and I take you through the formation of the Constitutional Court and why, the position of the judiciary, and how all white male it was. That's just a plain historical fact. There were 2 white women judges. So essentially, the power brokers were white males, even in the judiciary. And therefore, there was a challenge to make sure that the judiciary is more representative. And all of us find space in it and new voices that would come with the new constitution. And then I show you how the Constitutional Court was built, Mr. Mandela appointing new judges, and there the thing starts. They didn't have premises, they had to build new premises. Excuse me. And I tell you of my trip with Justice Johan Kriegler, sorry, on the new premises and his excitement about the new edifice of a new court on the hill. And I show you what a romantic time it was, because everything looked so hunky-dory. So we actually won everything. We won the World Rugby Cup. We won the Africa Cup of Nations. We won gold medals through Penny and others. We won the World Marathon through Tukwani and other people. And I just show you what a lovely golden era our land had as we made that transition. And then I start giving you the history of the court and the judiciary with the Chaskelson Court, and I move on to the Langa Court, to the Noble Court and the Mogoeng Court. And of course, I was the fly on the wall in all of that period. I could see exactly what was happening. And I hope I tell you faithfully the stories that went on, the jurisprudence that came out, and the challenges within the broader society. Because the book has the background, has the leitmotif of what's happening in society. And that gets reflected inevitably in the disputes that come before the courts. because courts are there to do just that, to do justice, to resolve disputes in society. And it comes a certain, Mr. Zuma becomes our president, and the courts become then the center of that whole contestation of power and exercise of executive authority. Then suddenly you see the tension between the legislature and the judiciary, the executive and the judiciary calling on both ends to fulfill their constitutional obligations. But it also gave us an opportunity for a wonderful rights jurisprudence. So suddenly people were testing the newly acquired rights, and the court had a fist in writing about just entitlements, the new entitlements that came on. So, and the book moves on, it goes to lighter moments, which I hope makes for easier reading, tea room banter, and serious and not so serious discussions. And ultimately, it ends up, of course, with Life as a Dimene, once one having gone through the gamut, and past my 60th birthday, which is not a big punctuation mark. Many people do make it a big one, it is not. And the mantra that I set out there and say, look, this is about fidelity to the law. It's about fidelity to the Constitution and other law. And it can never be fidelity to the ruling elite. And when judges bow to the ruling elite, then you are in deep trouble. Because somebody has to blow the whistle, like in a good soccer or rugby match, and you need nice, strong referees that stand in between the worked up players. But the referee must then know the law, must be a gentleman, a decent person, honest, and must blow the whistle every time without fear or favor, because the job requires that. And in the process, you get tackled, like I was tackled, and a few other judges were tackled. But it comes with the territory. Ask any referee. And half the field swears at you when you give a penalty to the wrong end. So it's a tough job. It's a job to be done. And it's done with fortitude, without fear or favor, but with kindness, because you want to produce just outcomes. And the book really wraps up there. And it is dedicated to all the young people of this land. By all, I mean all. And to all the young people of the African continent. And I express the wish and the hope that when they are oppressed, when they no longer enjoy freedom and dignity and social justice, the important ones of our entitlements, they will know it. And they will not succumb. And they will know that they have a duty, and the duty is that they should all rise so we can have a better country. That is the book in a nutshell. And I think I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I think you've given us a lot to work with and to steer the conversation. Maybe later, since you've brought in a football metaphor, maybe later I'll ask you to comment on Sundowns and their three. I hope you'll take a view. but for now, I'm going to hand
over Sundowns and Blue Bulls, because
Blue
I live
Bulls.
in Victoria.
Yeah.
About both. And they both lost this weekend, so it was not fun. Okay.
No, not a great weekend for you at all, I can see. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Strydom. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Khomotso. And let me start off by saying that I'm honored to share this platform with one of the country's really great lawyers. And Judge Moseneke, I want to thank you for this oral account. But I think perhaps more importantly for writing this book. You started off by saying that this book has many layers of themes, and that is indeed the case. And that you were the sort of fly on the wall, observing what was going on at the time when you served on the bench. I think there are two of the layers that have significance for me and also for the things I'm interested in. And the one is your description of the evolution of the court which I think everybody should take cognizance of, because it tells us that the life of a court is not always a pleasant one. You can run into difficulties, and then the question is, how do you manage those difficulties? And I think you have given us a wonderful insight in what happened at the time and the different sort of times and under the different chief justices. The other aspects of the book which I was particularly interested in was the fact that it gave us, I think, a very thorough and personal public record of the functioning of the court in times of social and political change, but also at a time of social and political turmoil. And you describe these events in excellent diplomatic style. And I want to also congratulate you on that, bringing that part of the story to the South African public. And as lawyers, we followed that. We followed that from a different perspective. But to read it from your perspective was extremely meaningful and helpful in understanding the functioning of the court in those difficult times. I want to say at this point, I'm not going to capture this event. I think many people would like to make comments and ask questions. So after this brief introduction about my experience of the book and what I can take out of it, let me just make one comment on the last issue concerning the functioning of the court in difficult times, when you have social and political developments which might put the court in a difficult spot. It reminds me about a very famous statement that was made by one of Germany's very prominent constitutional lawyers, Ernst Birkenförder, in a book that he wrote, I think it was in the late 70s or the beginning 80s, where he said that a constitution cannot live off the values created by itself. It has to be embedded in a sort of context, political, social, and legal context, which support the values of that constitution and which causes the courts to function properly in that context. And I think what your account has given us is that we have to think very, very carefully about how vulnerable courts may become in adversarial circumstances. And I think when we enter those troubled waters, that is when the courts are really tested. And that is when they sort of gain our respect or where they lose our respect. And I'm very glad to say that it has not happened with the Constitutional Court and many other courts in this country in difficult times. Also because of people like you who served on the bench. So I think those of us who've read it and those who still want to read it, this is a thought that should remain with us about the vulnerability of the court. But if you allow me, I want to move to a sort of remark you made in the chapter where you dealt with your deputy chairmanship under the auspices of the current Chief Justice. And it's not about him, it's about the office of the Chief Justice. And I want to, maybe if you want, and if you think you could sort of just enlighten us about some of the issues. About 2 weeks ago, there was a report about some of the courts running into experiencing difficult circumstances in the sense that the infrastructure is collapsing. They have problems with emails, they have problems with the lack of judges, some judgments are taking too long, etc., etc. And there was a sort of discussion with many practicing lawyers on this, and they were unanimous in their criticism, saying that the problem lies with the office of the Chief Justice and the infrastructure there and the staff. And I think it relates to the time when the functioning of the courts was taken over by that office. I understand that formally it fell under the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice. So I do not know whether similar circumstances were also experienced during your time, or whether this is a new development and how that should be handled. But because I think it impacts on the functionality of the courts, and it creates a sort of, not a good image of what's going on in some of the courts at least. And it seems to me from the report that the problems that we are experiencing at the moment are sort of fairly widespread. That brings me to a second report that was published less than a week ago in the press about the functioning of the Department of Justice, where it was said that, and it comes from the Portfolio Committee of Parliament on Justice, accusing the department of certain level of dysfunctionality and of not functioning up to standards, etc. And one official even asked for the Department of Justice to be placed under administration. So it seems to me that within the wider context of the justice system, we have these government organs which at the moment are not functioning optimally. And I can imagine that the functioning of the courts depend on these organs. It sort of affects the way in which they deal with cases, the speed at which they deal with cases, and many other aspects. And I just wanted to throw this into the discussion because of some of those aspects that came out in your book on the functioning of those organs in the administration of justice. And maybe you just can give us a few of your remarks on this. Thank you.
Judge, I think I would like to give you an opportunity to speak to what Professor Strydom has spoken to, and then I will jump into a series of questions.
Firstly, I'm grateful. Thank you for taking time to look at the book and to raise the issues that do come up. Yes, the book is quite obsessive in part about institutional stability. Look at the time I take to tell the nation how judges are appointed.
Yeah.
How courts are funded, how more than 80% of administration of justice occurs at the magistracy level, and why magistrates deserve our respect and attention, excuse me, and why those courts must be properly and fully resourced. I'll come to some detail in a moment. And I spent time to tell the reader about the amount of hard work of a high court judge, which I was. The flow and the level and the fact that after 1994, when the high courts predominantly served 2-3 million of us, now they were serving 30-40 million in 1994, now 55 million. Mm-hmm. So suddenly the system which was made for a smaller number, and I make that point, suddenly has to serve a much larger number. And then, of course, it places certain demands on them. And I explain also why. It was historically nonsensical to try and change all the judges because, one, you had no other judges, and two, you had to take time to train new judges that came in, like me and others who came into the pool. And it was done the best, I think, in that arm of state. Today, something north of 65% of all judges and magistrates are people of color, or they're not white males, let me put it that way. More women of all colors have come in and more other people of color. So we actually have a judiciary that has made the transition. Not without pain always, but actually the transition has been made. And at a jurisdictional and decision-making level, our judiciary has been amazing. Think about the TAC case. Think about al-Bashir, a head of state coming here and the High Court saying, arrest him. Think about poor appointments of National Director of Public Prosecutions, like the court saying, no, the process was irregular. Think about judgments where our court has called on Parliament and say, do your work, hold the executive accountable. Think about that whole group of judgments where we said, even prisoners, you treat with dignity. No, people must have access to healthcare, to water, to textbooks, to name it. So the courts at that practical, effective level and jurisprudential level, and look at our magistrates court. But what are the problems? And that's what you're pointing to, Professor Strydom, and I think it's quite legitimate. It begins to worry me. In the book, I tell how hard we worked to introduce a culture of industry, of hard work, of near perfection. You could look at our judgments, ask Ms. Mokwena, who worked at the court. And I tell you how we read every judgment line by line, all 11 of us. Every sentence, every judge would say, I don't like that sentence. It doesn't state the law the way I think it should, and so on. And they're there to see. They're not without imperfection, but they're near perfect because so much work was done. And Chief Justice is one of the big things they have to do. They have to be very active in protecting institutional integrity. Not to be confused with institutional independence. The two are interactive, but they're not the same thing. You need institutions that work, that are properly resourced, that are properly managed. And as you do that, you hope that you'll get the budget from government because judges don't have the purse, as we know, nor do they have the sword. So they depend on other arms of the state in order to be able to do that.
Prof. Henny, do you want to maybe take a moment to talk a little bit about what Judge has said about institutional integrity? Perhaps, in light of even, in light of the institutional issues that he's speaking to, in light of the questions around access to justice and whether or not the proper functioning of the courts really speaks to the impact on the rights of access to justice of all South African citizens, or what impact does that have?
Yeah, I mean, the institutional strength and functioning of the courts are extremely important. That's why the supporting organs of state or supporting institutions have a very important role to play to keep that institutional functionality at a high level. In one of the reports I mentioned, it came out that at the week during which that report was published, in courts, 129 cases could not be put on the roll because there were not enough judges to deal with them. So 129 cases had to sort of find a place in some court sometime down the line. And I think that's a specific example of access to justice, which is affected by the fact that there is something wrong here and it should be fixed. And that is only in one of the courts. And according to the reports, we have many other cases where judgments have not been handed down in good time. They've been delayed for years without proper explanation. And that also affects access to justice. And it reflects not in a good way on the functioning of the courts. And if that is the case, and I have no reason to doubt the reports I refer to, one often hear about it from lawyers appearing in the courts as well. We must identify where the problem lies and it must be fixed.
Prof, do you think there's any role also that law schools generally can play? I mean, there's 17 law faculties in the country, and we are producing upward of 200, 300 graduates per year, all of whom are going to enter the legal profession, all of who are going to engage with the courts. What role also do you see law schools having in really facilitating better access to justice? I mean, surely I really like what Judge had to say about All Rise and it being a call to action for all of us in the profession. And I wonder if you could take a view on what role law schools and law teachers and law researchers need to play in really improving on or facilitating the right to access to justice?
Well, I think at some of the faculties where you have well-functioning law clinics, they already provide that kind of service. And I think in many of the cases, they did a fantastic job. It's always a matter of resources. So we must remember it's not the main functioning of a law faculty to do that. Mm-hmm. But where they can do it, they should do it. And I think it significantly contributes to the issue about access to justice, especially for indigent people who can't afford, expensive lawyers and so on. And we know about great cases that have gone through the law clinics and ended up positively in the courts for the complainant. So that's one area. I do not know how widespread this practice is, and where all faculties in the country have it at a good functioning level. But I know that, the universities that I deal with all have it. That's one area I think which should be maintained and should be sustained through the usual sort of staff components and financial resources.
I think more of what I'm asking, or what I'm wanting to engage with, is really our style of research. What are we working on? Our teaching style, in that sense, because that's the very specific, unique role that we have to play as law schools outside of the law clinics, the functioning of the law clinics, the very specific role that we have to play as researchers.
Yeah, that's a curriculum issue. It's something that every law faculty should look at, whether its curriculum provides for that, and sort of developing the skills in that regard, and supporting the kind of research that we need in that respect. And I think if we take this seriously, it is something that should be on the agenda of faculty meetings and discussions.
I teach first-year law students, and one of the things that we've tried to do, or one of the imperatives of the University of Johannesburg, is to decolonize the curriculum for many different reasons. There has been a call to decolonize legal education and tertiary education more broadly. And I would love to get your view on where we are as the profession with the so-called decolonization project. Are we moving in the right direction, or are we paying lip service to the issue?
Let me start off this way. I try to start the book with some level of historical honesty. Uncomfortable as it might be, but historical honesty. And that, dawned on me when I was a young man. But of course, I wasn't a usual young man. I was an activist young man. So I was much more conscious about the fact that our history is a history of colonialism, which mutated into apartheid in the end. In fact, apartheid comes quite towards the tail end, sort of more effectively from 1948 onwards, from 1910 already, with the formation of union, already had a constitution that said only white males will vote. Not even white females made the cut. They couldn't vote either in 1910. They voted only in 1928. So it was basically, as I say quite often, it was a male-centric, a white male-centric kind of power arrangement, and which kept out everybody else. And historically, that's quite true. And as an incident of colonialism, of course, was an imposition of the law. And because if you get to any place and you colonize it, you're going to find this existing law, and the one who's most powerful would replace that and supplant that with their own law. In fact, you saw the English try to do it to people of Dutch origin when they came here, and there was a fight back to make sure that Roman Dutch law is not crowded and taken out by the English law. And as I say in the book, except in certain areas in commercial law where Roman Dutch was not as developed as it might should have been for modern commercial trade. Now, indigenous law was there and was easily ousted out. And one of the ways of ousting it out, of course, was to have a law running, from side to side, wall to wall, and that you would call the common law, but then after 1910. And then in that way, no other law would contest with that law. And the law would be common to everybody, every citizen. And I'm noticing in the book that even citizens should not have the right to vote, as I told you in 1910. Only white males had the right to vote. That law bound everybody. So it was common only to the sense that it was at the behest of the colonial power. So no amount of repeating of it would make it any different. So when I was young and I was studying law in Robben Island, I said, I have to study Latin 1, Roman, Afrikaans Literaries 1, and English 1. And because the sources themselves were foreign, therefore the language had to be foreign, to excavate the law and know what it is. And I tell you in the book, I just thought about that, pushed it aside and got on with the job. The job was to want to become a lawyer and use it for my own ends, as I did later on, in the sense that I was a lawyer within a struggle setting. Now, having said that historically, that is fine. It's a good historical point to make. And the implications were, of course, that our marriages were not marriages. So all our children were legitimate children. On death, the consequences of death and or divorce or parting was never recognized by law, so could not be enforced. And that actually increased patriarchy in the sense that men became stronger over women. And once indigenous law was codified, look at the Zulu Code and any one of those, it was patriarchal, it was near inhumane. Yeah. And the Kroll head dominated and controlled everything else that moved and shifted around them. And that was not the notion. African women had a very proud role and position within the Kroll, and they're very important power brokers within the Kroll. So in short, indigenous law was stunted, common law grew, and as I explained, it was the judges' law. It's the judges. The law professors taught it at university, and the judges policed it. And that became the law of the land. And because of parliamentary sovereignty, that law had to accord with what Parliament said. So quick common law had to be denigrated, yet wonderful principles of equality, for instance, of equal worth of people, and so on. It was quite advanced because it was a law of the 16th century, which was really a law developed even contrary to feudalism. So it was progressive in its time. But there we were, and the Parliament started making laws that went very contrary to the common law principles. That is just fact. So that wonderful Grundnorm had to give way to a statutory overlay of oppression, really, So that is something that we need to know. And that's what brought us to 1994. So the next question becomes, what's to be done? And those who read the Constitution said, well, you can't replace the common law by the snap of a finger. It's an experience of 300 years or more. You can't wipe out indigenous law either, even in its stunted and underdeveloped state. So the compromise was to have the Constitution as a supreme law, and then to have the common law, indigenous law surviving, provided they accord with constitutional values. And the courts have done that by and large. Now, what is the task of today? My complaint in the book is, I haven't had any of my professors say to me, this here is a history of the common law. Many professors in our time and day will sooner look at Foot and van der Kessel than to look at the provisions of the Constitution. So my big point is the following, is that in 1994, we created certain common values that we said we will do justice with. We can debate later whether the government has done most of them, and I'm sure the answer will probably be no, and we can debate that. But as a matter of law, we bound ourselves to new values, to a new legal culture, to a new way of teaching. Some people, like Dr. Mudiri in Tekis or something, will say, even the Constitution itself does not go far enough. And I'm not going to have that debate now and go to war on that. There are certain parts of the Constitution that don't go far enough. But the rump of what we have provided for in the Constitution is what any revolutionary anywhere in the world would want to toast to. The fundamental value, for instance, the socioeconomic rights, you don't find in any constitution in the world except us. We went many steps further to make sure that, for instance, the position of gender equality is so central. You're going to say to me, well, women are still being killed. Yeah, let's have that debate. Because then you're collapsing two things. You're collapsing misgovernance on the one hand with the high values and ideals that the Constitution represents. And the ones that we fought for over many, many years. So when you decolonize the law, you'll have to look at those parts of the law that are reminiscent of an unequal society, that are reminiscent of oppressive arrangement, that don't pay proper service and regard to the desire of a society to advance equality. Those parts of the law that, for instance, do not acknowledge the fact that you're going to have land justice in our country. Let me give a simple example. You have, to the extent that the common law would say, dominium is the highest form of a right. Ownership is the beginning and the end. And the dominus, he who owns the property, needs to allege no more than that I'm the owner. And the owner shifts immediately on any occupier. They must really say, what the hell are they doing there? How have they come to be there? So the owners, the law is loaded in, there was the notion of dominium, of ownership under the Roman Dutch law. Let's give us an example. And it knew no qualifications except qualifications like servitude, which were duly registered against that property. Beyond that, there was no limitation to what the owner of property may do. Now, law has mutated and migrated and moved away from that notion, which was a feudal notion of ownership, as an example. So, good professors and good lecturers, there is a whole room and range to be able to understand and interpret the law, including the common law, in ways that are liberatory, in ways that advance the higher goals of a decolonized, equal, fair, accessible society. So there's no magic in decolonization. It is, what kind of just society do you produce? Post-apartheid, post-colonialism. And that is, and I think curricula should be focusing on that and seeking to, not to change things for their own sake. As Chief Justice Mohammed said, we keep from the past what is good, but we keep the door firmly shut for what is bad about the past. So there are features of the common law which are very useful and that the Constitution has found deemed to keep. The unuseful ones have to be mutated and developed all the time in order to accord with the kind of changed, democratic, open, free, and equal society that we hope for. Long answer, but that's what it brought me to. From my childhood on Robben Island to my understanding of jurisprudence now.
No, that's exactly what I envisaged your response would be. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy that you took us down that road, Judge. And really speaking to the issue of transformation and how our law is interpreted and how our law develops in practice. I got a great question from one of your former clerks, Marsha Michetti. She said I must mention her name. And she really fantastic question about whether or not there would be value in providing judges with training in relation to unconscious bias, which has been quite a buzzword in the last couple of months. You will know. So whether or not there's any value in training judges and or engaging with judges who are rising to the bench in relation to these issues of so-called unconscious bias, which I'm not 100% sure is legitimate, but that's another conversation for another day. But I think I would enjoy your comment as to whether or not there's value in such training or such engagement with members of the bench.
Yes. Given our past, we all come to the job with all sorts of baggage. And you remember that American jurisprudence who led the realist school, Frank always talked about the inarticulate premise. That part of you that is unstated, it comes from your upbringing, from your worldview, it comes from who your mother and father are, where did you go, did you have any religion exposure, all of those things put together usually constitute an inarticulate premise, a silent starting point. So this has been known for some time, as I say. Even Ezra Pound, yet another writer, but also lawyer, was always concerned about what do judges bring to the job? What do magistrates bring to the job? Of course, they would have a premise. And legal training and experience over years is meant to break that down to tolerable levels where judges can be able to act without fear or favor. Remember, that is the high standard. So without bias, fear or favor, or without prejudice, fear or favor. Now, when I started as a judge, Chief Justice Chaskelson introduced consciousness and bias training, which was quite fascinating, and we needed it. We had just come out of apartheid. For younger people, I can tell you the story very quickly, and to you, Ms. Chetty, was that they give you, we went to a retreat as judges. We had one at the Constitutional Court. They give you a set of questions which are typical of the prejudices we carry on. If there's a crisis, who's more likely to cry first, men or women? And then you, the judge, must make the tick. If there's likely to be a dishonesty in a business arrangement, will it be an Afrikaans-speaking person, a Zulu-speaking person, a Jewish person, or a person of Indian origin? Then you've got to make a tick. If there's going to be issues of violence, who's more likely to use violence? Is it a Zulu-speaking person or a Tswana-speaking person, or a person with an Indian background, or a South African with a European extraction? Who's likely to resort to violence? So what the questions did was to really go to where we are most challenged. Who's most likely to lie? An African person, an Indian person, a white person. And then who's likely to steal? Who's likely to break into your home? So you set all these questions and you give them to, and the judges completed the questionnaires without names. So you didn't know where the answers originated. And some of the answers were quite surprising, to say the least. In the sense that there were these built-in biases. But in most judicial training, both for magistrates and for judges, attention is given to, without calling it unconscious bias, attention is given, recognition is recognized that people would have bias. And it's recognized that bias training, or we call it anti-bias training, is something valuable. It was done quite often. When I became a judge, I was trained on that. And I think subsequently we had it trained at the Judicial Training Institute, we used those questionnaires quite a bit. And usually you use non-judges to do it. You know, like HR practitioners and or psychologists and or psychiatrists to do that. And it often helped. And then it will be the basis for lectures around those things. So yes, judges have to try very hard to put their blinkers and to try and act dispassionately. And if they don't, as you know, that's why we accept fallibility within the judicial space. And that is why there are levels of appeal. And the higher you go on the levels of appeal, the more the judges. So if you're unhappy with one judge, you're going to get 3 judges. Happy with 3, you're going to get 5 in the SCA. Unhappy with 5, you're going to get 11 in the Constitutional Court. There is also an attempt to create a sieve to reduce the level of bias. And that's one of the reasons also why judiciaries have to be demographically representative. If it's all white males only, you might fear. If it's all black males only, you have reason to fear. If it is women only, you have reason to fear. So it's quite important that even the collection and assortment of judges, of magistrates, of people who make decisions ought to be drawn across the broader society. And our constitution goes far in trying to do that. And currently today, if we went into the magistrates' court, you're going to find a remarkable spread of backgrounds of people who make decisions. And by and large, I think the judiciary has done well in the last 25 years, aside the institutional challenges which Professor Strydom alluded to. And we have to fight those also. And the public have to help the courts to be better resourced. There must be enough money. There must be infrastructure and facilities so that that arm of the state can do its work. One of the known tactics around the world is to weaken the judiciary by giving it the least resources. You can do that to the army, you can do that to the police, you can do that to universities. You can weaken them by reducing their resources. So we need to guard against the judiciary being made a place of incompetence because of low resources.
And you know, following on that, Judge, and really still within the theme of institutional integrity, you speak quite extensively in the book about the Hlophe matter and all of the things, the events that surrounded that issue. And I know that you noted in the book as well that the issue is sub judice, but I would appreciate if you would really make a comment about what kind of an impact that may or may not have on institutional integrity broadly, and particularly the impact it may have on how members of the public engage with the judiciary or see the judiciary or see justice to be done. I would very much appreciate that, and I know staying within the required framework and not stepping outside of the lines. I would appreciate.
Yes, that. One of the trainings that you talked about judges being trained around bias. One of the trainings is not to cause unnecessary controversy if you're a judge. And the book tries to honor that tradition. Most judges live cloistered lives. I'm one of the forward ones whose faces you see often. But most judges go and work for 20 years. They write the judgments, you see their name, you never see their face. They retreat into retirement, maybe go farming or traveling or whatever else. And they don't even write about how the experience was. That's an average judge. And therefore controversy is something that you don't court, you don't invite. Because judges are supposed to have a judicial demeanor, a balance, a certain sense of balance, which you hope from any judge you appear before, that they would always have. There's a beautiful word in Afrikaans, evenredigheid. a measure of evenness, of ability to stay there. It's a beautiful, beautiful word in Afrikaans. Now, so judges try and do that. And therefore, when I wrote about my colleagues, and I wrote about Judge President Sope, it was important to give you, the reader, the facts and refuse to draw a conclusion, something which judges do and they're bound to do ordinarily because the case is not finalized. But I also put it out there to say judges themselves have enormous obligations. One of these is to submit to their own ethical code. Two, not to try and subvert it, not try and duck it, not to try and, run rings around it. Because they have a higher duty than an average litigant. Litigants do all sorts of things. There's a chapter in there where I show you, there was a period where every point was taken, every technical point was taken, and the courts had to deal with those issues. So judges have to submit to the judicial code. They've got to reject what George Bernard Shaw calls professional protectionism. If you're a member of the bar, you're obliged to report an advocate who acts unethically. You have a duty to report, and you can be charged for failing to report your own colleague. So you're placing a much higher standard on people who become judges in the future. And judges are in exactly the same position. You have to report the ethical or the misconduct of others. That is true, if you ask me, of all arms of the state. I think the legislature must have that same high ethical standard. The executive must have the same high standard. People who are prosecutors, who are prosecuting other people and intervening in their lives, must have the same high standard. The standard of ethical forbearance, of submitting to the law, of submitting to the task, fidelity to the law. And it's only in that way that we're going to produce proper and just outcomes. And that way that we're going to advance our society. So I use the process, and I decry the fact that 12, 13 years after the complaint was made, we're still not at the end of this matter. For the judiciary, it's something shameful. We can't be proud of that. I think she's got to unmute. You got to unmute your.
Yeah, she's muted at the moment.
I think I've got technological fatigue from this year. So, yeah. But I said thank you for the comment, Judge. I would have loved for you to surprise us and take a view, but I understand exactly why you couldn't. But I would like you to take a view on another issue. You spoke quite extensively about the times when you were passed over for the role of Chief Justice. And I think you spoke quite candidly. And I think, speaking for myself, it evoked a lot of thoughts about leadership and what leadership really means, and the imperative on all of us to focus ourselves on service as opposed to power or positions or roles or specific titles, but to focus all of our energies as servants of the country. But I would like you to maybe make a comment as to whether you thought all of that controversy was personal, if you felt that it was personal at the time, if you felt that it was an attack on you at the time, if you would be so kind as to take a view, Judge.
Memoir, you're taking me to deep waters, aren't you?
Yes.
I'm not, no, but it's simpler. No, it's much simpler than that. Look, here it is. The Constitution permits the president to make a pick of a Chief Justice and a Deputy Chief Justice and a head of the SCA. There was a deal at the bargain which was struck in 1990 1993 when we wrote the Constitution, okay? And the final Constitution also, 1996. The reasoning was a checks and balances argument. The president may not, as you know, refuse to appoint somebody who the JSC has found to be fit and proper, and with proper and adequate experience. The law doesn't say so in so many words, but the convention is quite clear. And if the law was tested, it would be interpreted that way. Because the purpose of the provision of establishing the JSC and selecting judges in that way, not like in the past, where the Minister of Justice pointed at a judge and he became a judge. Here is a body on which the academy is represented, judges are represented, attorneys, advocates. So this is a much broader body. And therefore, once it has given a nod to a candidate or candidates, the president must appoint them. And if he refuses to appoint them, he must write a whole dissertation, why not? And we've done well because all the people who have been appointed have not felt any way to be indebted to a president or to somebody. It is more colleagues and the academy and other people who thought that they were okay for the job, okay? And that's why we really had it going well. There's some criticism, but by and large, we got the judiciary going on reasonably well. And the magistracy too, it quite well. But just look at your television, you'll see that magistrates and judges wake up most days and they're in their courts, and most of the news that you see in this country, 60-70% of the news is about courts, and what courts have done for that particular day. So we do wake up to go and do our work as we are required. But then the president has the prerogative to handpick the Chief Justice and the Deputy Chief Justice. I was handpicked by President Mbeki. We're a court of 11, and he handpicked Chief Justice Langa and handpicked me as his deputy. And he could have handpicked anybody else, but the Constitution allows him to do it. President Zuma handpicked 3 times people who are not me. and he acted lawfully. The law allowed him to do it, and he did it. You couldn't attack it as unlawful. And exercise the discretion. And what does a smart boy do? You keep your head down and do your work, even better than you did it before. There are many other options. One is to resign. Another is to scream, murder, murder around every corner. And the other is to become a good judge. And somebody was quipping, Khomotso said, maybe if I was appointed Chief Justice, I would have written so many judgments with so much passion and with so much law and made so much contribution maybe to our jurisprudence. I would have been locked down in with budgets and with meeting with politicians and, opening conferences and all of that stuff. So maybe there was a silver lining there because I had the free range and the free to basically be at the court and to make sure the court works and to make sure that you were there and and to make sure that there are outcomes, and that we stay all faithful, hardworking, honest, and produce the outcomes that the nation expects of us. So now if you ask me personally, of course, yes, I would have wanted to be Chief Justice. If that's the answer you want. Of course I would have wanted to be. Of course, there's been a lovely story from prisoner to Chief Justice, a great story. But it didn't happen, and yet I had a very fulfilled time on the court and made common cause with Chief Justice Mogoeng. We agreed on values and we were betting on the same side by the time we were done. And I'm proud and happy about that outcome.
Judge, that takes me so perfectly into my next question. It's something that I reflect on often. Purpose is something that I reflect on often as an individual and as a lawyer and as a law teacher, and how our purpose doesn't always match our plan, or things don't always go according to what we imagined. And there's a great quote from the book, from the foreword. Judge Cameron says, Dikgang's pen exudes his life's purpose to bring social justice, good governance, an enlightened condition of autonomy to the people of our country. And I really want to ask you, Judge, from where do you derive your purpose? Where do you derive your drive and the inclination towards serving our people?
Well, when I'm with my pastor, he says, well, you must have derived this from the Almighty, okay? When I'm with revolutionaries, they say, yeah, you're a great revolutionary, I think. And when I'm with law students and professors, I'm not sure what should I say, where one draws that. But let's put it this way. From childhood, I think I spent time in my own liberator to explain why I hated injustice. I hated unfairness, as a child. And in other talks that I've had, I often talk about my grandchildren. Some of them are somewhere here around the house. Now that's an empty nest, so my grandchildren come in and stay here. They're better here than with their parents, okay? But I would have tested them quite many times. I would take 3 sweeties and give them to the one granddaughter, and I'll take 10 and give them to another, and I'll take 1 and I give it to yet a grandchild. And there's 6 of them, and I take another and I give them 15 sweets. Because a revolution. Grandpa, are you off your mind? Grandpa, you're mindless. What is all this? She gets 10, I get 1. Grandpa, not even 5. I get 1, she gets 10. And the whole house goes back up. Now, I'm talking about innate sense of fairness that I think we come wired in, wherever we come from, whichever way we look, whichever size we are, whatever our gender, religion, and so on. But I think there's an innate human sense of fairness. Don't ask me what happens when somebody takes R1 billion and steals it from the public coffers. Don't ask me what happened to it. But at the beginning, when we start, we all have a sense of fairness. Mr. Mandela says nobody's born a racist. That's an example. Nobody's born greedy. Nobody's born, okay? We can go on down the line. Nobody is born a woman basher. So we acquire things as we move on, as we grow up and so on. But when I was young, my sense of right and wrong was quite high. And I tell you in the book how I always hated apartheid. I could see the lawns on those rugby fields on the other side in Pretoria West were better than my rugby field and soccer field in Atteridgeville. I could see it. This one was dusty, this one was blonde, green and beautiful. I could see the schools, the classes were different. I could see everything was different. So, and it developed quite a bit. Of course, then going to Robben Island would have entrenched my sense of right and wrong. And we often ask the question, what are the attributes of a just society? What should happen for people to live well? And certain things are obvious. Certain things are pretty obvious, that you're going to deal with your citizens in an even manner. You're going to try and create institutions that would ensure there's a rule of law, institutions that would ensure there's social justice, that would ensure that there's land justice, that there would be other forms of justice, gender justice, and so on. So those things stayed with me, I'm afraid. And it's too late now to shake them off, I think. but it's because in a public space, we can go to Scandinavian countries and look. The taxation sits at around 50%, some 55 to 60%. But those who work for government account for every penny. They built for them schools. You must go to Sweden, go to Norway, go to Denmark, go to Belgium, and in part the Netherlands. But those who are in government riding bicycles. I met the Minister of Justice there when I visited The Hague. He came to meet me, was riding on a bicycle. And I could see this with all the clips for his pens in his hand. And we had a discussion with the Minister of Justice. Now, they've converted everybody else into civil servants right up to the top. And that money is channeled carefully, faithfully, to do what? To improve the lives of citizens, to render services, to uplift the way they live, where they live, how they live, and to protect fundamental rights and freedoms so that they can actually have dignity in their lives and so on. So those are the kind of things that ought to move us, hopefully. Mm-hmm. And therefore, my notion of justice is a robust, substantive notion of justice. It's not black letter justice. It is the outcome fair? And you can see it in the book. It runs right through the book. Is society fair? Are we doing things that are fair to all of us? Mm. I think that's where it came from. It's a long answer, but and I'm holding on to that now, sort of in my later years, and I'll probably go to the grave hoping that, as I do in the book, that when it's all unfair and doesn't work, we will all rise and say, no, we deserve better. As I did when I was a young person. I rose up against apartheid and said, no, I don't think this is how I want to die. I didn't want to die the same way that I was born.
Judge, I promise you, I've got just two more questions for you, just two. But it really comes, it fits in quite beautifully to what you've just said. You spoke very candidly also in the book about the life estimeni matter and your arbitration award in that regard. Judge, do these, given your sacrifices, given what you've done, given your long service to the country, I think we all felt a collective grief when all of that happened, and to watch all of the facts sort of come to light and unfold. But I want to ask you, do you think it feels different for you, having given so much of yourself? Do you think that the injustices that our people face feels a bit different or more for you, having given so much of your life for things to be better?
Yeah, certainly more. So I don't want to be overly sentimental. I'd hoped that we would have used the opportunities we had to create a much more just society. That hope has not diminished yet. You can see it in the book, you can see it. But I'd hoped that we would take in those values and make them very much part of us. I'd hoped that we would go out there and combat crime and violent crime in a country like us, by all means. Not only the police, the detectives, but also by the social arrangements we make so that crime must diminish. You know, in Greenland or Iceland, they've got something like a rate of 1 murder a year, because they're much fewer people than us. But there are societies like that where crime levels are truly low. Yes, I would have hoped that we would have made sure that we have quality education and we produce the best, particularly from amongst those who were previously deprived. And that we spend so much more to take care on multiple fronts, because what we wrote in 1994 was really putting our hearts down and say, these are the things that we wish for ourselves. They can't suddenly change, how could they? These are the things that we thought our struggle for liberation was about. We wrote them down, we voted them in. So when Life as Dimeni came, yes, it hurt deeply. Some things did hurt when I was in court and so on, but we dealt with most of them. We did our best and our damnness to get going. But these were helpless people, vulnerable people. And most of you don't know, Life as Dimeni also was a fairly carbon copy of our demography. The South Africans from all races, all backgrounds, but they're helpless because they needed mental health care. And when it was absent, of course, in circumstances that were placed, they died. And more people died in Life as Dimeni than in Sharpeville and Marikana put together. So it was quite a tragedy. And when you get the granular, the details of what they had to go through, it was quite challenging. I think it shook my foundations of the quest for a more just society. It rocked that. The strong, solid judge that I thought I was, I found myself quite rocky. And we're yet to understand where was the money taken to. You know, from Life as Dimeni, the contract shut down, the money not used that year and the year thereafter, and the people are thrown where they were thrown and they die. And in the inquiry, I tried to follow up what happened to the money. It was on budget, where's the money? It's a mere suspicion now where the money went to, but I mean, wherever the money went to, the people died. And many had their bodies decomposed in inefficiently run mortuaries. So that was no fun. And that sits direct opposite to my hope and our hope, our collective hope. For a good life for all. That's what I say in the book. So we're sitting. That's why I opened the book at Morogoro and I closed it at Life as Dimeni. You can see the gap there.
Thank you, Judge, for your candidness on that issue and on hope. And this is my final question. There's one of my favorite quotes from the book. You say, "A judge may not suffer from indecision. There is no room for intellectual constipation or for a pen that dries up." So on this, Judge, where do we go from here? Where do you go from here? We really, I think, would value your message of hope because we know there's work to do. We're not at the end. So I would appreciate if you would give us some parting words, Judge.
Oh yeah, and the book has a lot of lovely moments and it's got lots of hope that's buzzing out there. Somebody said to me, "You sound like a failed revolutionary." That is true. The outcomes have not been achieved in the way that I dreamt of as I was young. True. But at the same time, we've achieved so much, and that's what I record. At the same time, we've produced you, Ms. Mokoena, who's now an academic, but at every webinar I've gone to, whether by civil society, whoever else, or I run into young people who are trained at the court, were trained at other places, who are at various positions, and who are, whether they are at equal education or they're Section 27 or LRC, wherever they might be, and who are still battling. So this was not a solo flight. It never was, it is not, and it will never be. So yes, I think part of this discussion in this book is to get young people who mainly are studying law and to law professors, to the academy and everybody, and say, we have to rethink, we have to reimagine and dedicate ourselves to these values. Again, there's no doubt about it, that they're important, they're valuable. And you can't throw the rule of law through the window, can you? Then you've got the baby gone, the bath water gone. I think even the bath would go. So we have to have parameters of the law. We have to have a law that strives for a just society that is fair to each one of us and to all of us collectively. We have to try and make the law to help us destroy poverty. Each time I look at that peri-urban poverty and those pictures of people living in terrible circumstances. Again, a beautiful Afrikaans word is agtelike omstandighede. Terrible circumstances. They don't deserve that. We have to find the land, we have to cut it up, we have to give it services, we have to give them stands and let them build their own homes and live their own lives, surely. So I'm not down and expired. Somebody said, when you retire, you expire. No, I'm not looking for a new job. I'm not going to take a new job, anything like that. But I hope to continue to encourage young people to say, you have to fashion your own mission, a generational mission. Fanon told us that ages ago. And I formulated my generational mission, which was to defeat apartheid. And you guys have to formulate your mission. I don't know what it is, but you guys have to roll up your sleeves and go and do it. And we must do it properly, within the ambit of the law, without violence, and thoughtfully. Judicial did a little bit of that work. We need much more work to be done. And that is why I'm excited that you are an academic. I hope many more will, as I've said, queue up to advocate Batoya and say, we want a job here. I want to be a prosecutor. I want to be state advocate. Let's get the good guys get to the good jobs, the important jobs. And not leave the bad guys to take all the good jobs. And then we can, in institutions, I'm not talking politics. There's more important work to be done in institutions, at universities, at police stations, at prosecutorial level, at investigative level, at all the institutions that society prides itself in. Our best young people should be working there. So you have a role. If this is bad, what you're seeing, you can push the tide back. And I'm just making sure that the debate goes on by showing you one institution of state and say, look how valuable it could be and how we should protect it.
Thank you so much, Judge. I don't think I can express the honor and the privilege that it has been for me to sit with you. Even though it's virtual, maybe we'll do this in person one day. It's virtual, this has been fine for me, and really, really just a joy. And I appreciate this conversation so much, and your honesty and your openness and your warmth. I don't think anybody can say that they didn't feel you coming from the screen. So we really did experience you today. Thank you so much to my colleague, Professor Strydom, for joining me and for the comments you made earlier on in this conversation. Thank you for all of the audience that has come and joined us this afternoon. Thank you so much to the Faculty of Law. Professor Mbedi, thank you so much for joining us as well. The Library of the University of Johannesburg, we thank you so much for your hard work and all of your efforts. To the publishing house, Pan Macmillan, we thank you so much for this opportunity available to us. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a lovely evening and a lovely week ahead.
Thank you so much. And to your participants, I just want to say thank you. Quite a large number, and they've stayed quite faithful. They've remained throughout the discussions, even when ESCOM had different ideas about whether this should continue or not. But I'm grateful to the university and to the law school, the dean and all of you. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you, Homotso.
And good night.
Thank you, Prof.
Right.
Thank you.
Wish you all well.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.